All right. Um, Welcome, everybody. What we're going to first start out with today, pretty basic stuff. I'm going to start in with kind of going through syllabus expectations for you over the course of this semester as we're working through some of these quant methods things with the number of people who we have. Like, we've been fantastic. We've been able to grow the program, but more people in this section than I've ever had before. And so starting to think about, in collaboration with previous GAs, maybe some tweaks to the class to make this more manageable for you all, more manageable for us, and things along those lines. So um, every year we've had like a few tweaks and adjustments and things along those lines, which I think is good. It keeps us kind of fresh and on not stagnant. But it also means that sometimes you change things and it works, and sometimes you change things and it doesn't. So uh, we'll go through and try and be patient and see how things are working with this semester. But I think it's good, and I think it's going to work. But we'll kind of see how things go as we move forward with stuff. So today, just initial expectations. We're going to get started in basic statistics principles. I guess one was the everybody, I'm assuming, has had sort of a basic sort of undergrad stat course. When was the last time people had a stat level course? Okay, so it's been a while. Okay. 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 I know. The, the Johnny, you get introduced. Johnny's sort of doing stuff right now too, so I know that every spring semester. Okay, cool. So, and this is what we generally find is people coming in with different levels of comfort, exposure. Anybody have multiple stat courses outside of just their basic sort of probably required? Okay, so most of you, right? So we've got some people who are probably going to be more familiar with different concepts, terms, things along those lines. People who may be um, less familiar, a little bit rusty on some of this stuff. Um, does anybody sort of have a high degree of apprehension about sort of quant sort of methods stuff? It's okay, yeah. Yeah. I mean, if no one did, I'd be like, oh, you're also a bunch of liars. So, um, and that's fine. And so, different approaches to teaching classes. This class will likely be different than other courses that you've had. Part of that is just because it's a graduate level stat class versus an undergrad stat class. Undergrad stats, you just kind of learn basic concepts, like sort of what is this, how does it work, how do you generally interpret it, not getting too deep into stuff. Here, you're all in doctoral programs. A doctoral program is a research degree, in case no one to let you know that, right? And so some people, maybe clinical people, like, oh, well, I just want to see clients. Well, you're in a PhD program, which means you signed up for a whole bunch of research. So you're going to have to know that too, right? Thinking about this from an applied standpoint, I'm not going to have you write out proofs and things along those lines, but I do want you to understand these tools. I want you to understand where they're coming from, what's going on, and how to interpret them, sort of strengths and weaknesses, when our inferences are probably we can be more confident in them, and when we can't. And so this starts to require a little bit more under the hood work. It's not going to be math heavy, but you will need to do some math. The nice thing is applied statistics is generally arithmetic, maybe a little bit of algebra when we get into regression, stuff like that, but it's not hard advanced stuff. I had in my multivariate class, we had to crank out some matrix algebra, which was a pain. I started this when I first started, like, all right, we need to do matrix algebra. And then I'm like, nah, actually, I don't know that we need to do matrix algebra. That's a time suck, right? So most of the stuff that we're going to be doing, we're going to be using our statistical programs, which is really nice. But also what we never want to do is just plug something into a computer program. It spits out some numbers, and then we just report that without actually knowing what those mean, where they came from, and whether or not the stuff that we got makes any sense. I see that sometimes people say, well, here's my results. Back, well, none of that actually makes sense given the context that you want, right? And so you want to be able to go through and evaluate, interpret, sort of know when to use different approaches. This is the other thing too, as we start to go through, you may have 3 or 4 different ways that you could do. And so a lot of what we're going to do this semester is talk about decision points. Okay, given this context, what's going to be the best approach given this set of data? And that's always going to change, right? So a little bit more involved with things than probably your typical undergrad class, but because statistics is cumulative, right? Sometimes we're in a class back, well, I just, teach Psych 1000. Like, well, I didn't understand sort of brain regions, but that was this thing. And so I never need to worry about that again. That's not the way quant stuff works. If you don't understand variance or standard deviation or standard error, it's not going away. It's going to keep continuing to come up and come up. So what we're going to start today working with just a quick review, some very, very basic concepts, principles. Make sure we're going to move through it pretty quickly to make sure that people are kind of on the same page. But always, if you have questions, come talk with me, talk with Matt. Matt couldn't make it here today, but Matt is very smart, very kind, happy to help you go through and work through this stuff. So if you have questions, talk amongst each other, come talk to me. Just really want to make sure everybody's on the same page before we move forward onto the next thing so that no one feels like they're lost, they're not getting it, so on and so forth. Okay. Questions about any of that? All right, cool. Well, I've met some of you on team today, but I don't know most of you. So if we would, let's go through and do introductions. You're probably all sick of introductions because you all probably know each other. I don't know you though. So we'll start here. Just go through, tell me your name, who you're working with, where you're from, and kind of like what you are thinking about in terms of research interests. You don't have to pitch a thesis to me, but just sort of general stuff. Yeah, go for it. Okay. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Kate. Kate, right? Okay. Yes. All right. Strong representation of Pennsylvania thus far. Nice. All right. I'm sorry, what's that? Oh, okay. Oh, Mandy, we've had several email correspondence. Yeah. Wonderful to meet you in person. Wow. Okay. 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 No, I think that's good. I want to talk with you about research ideas. That's something. So very cool. Very cool. Yeah. What I'm doing here is I'm writing down all information about you. So I'm really, really awful with names, like real bad. Like for this first couple of weeks, I'll probably just like point at people and say like, you tell me something. But I'll get there. So thank you. Yeah. All right. Are you a Patriots fan? Good. I was gonna say, well, it looks like someone capped out at a B. Um, Glad to hear it. Yeah. Cool. Very cool. So Johnny and I worked together for quite some time. Johnny is looking at applying for graduate programs in the fall, and so he's in that process where you all have been. So if you have thoughts, recommendations, suggestions, things you wish you would have known, uh, uh, please pass those tips and tricks along. Johnny's modest. He's been sort of working through in our lab and doing some stuff with uh, um, some upper level statistics courses. So invited him to come in. So this is why you haven't seen him uh, before in any of your other classes. So cool. Thanks, Johnny. Boise, I got several family members that live up in Boise. Yeah, yeah, it's gotten big. It's it's growing. Yeah, yeah. Well, welcome. Cool. Well, wonderful, everybody. Again, I'm uh, Josh. Please call me Josh. You don't need to call me Dr. Clapp, or that's too formal for. We're going to be working in way too close quarters for Dr. Clapp nonsense. Um, I do trauma-related research, trauma and anxiety-focused stuff. I'm a clinical person, so experimental people, show of hands. We're good. Okay. I'm going to give you a lot of trauma related data. So you're going to be by proxy trauma experts by the time we finish up with this. It's just the data that I have to go through and work with and stuff like that. But don't worry, you don't have to have, no one needs to have special knowledge of trauma and anxiety to go through and sort of work with some of this stuff. But um, if, if all our examples seem pretty dark, like it's just the stuff that we've got going on, right? Back, boy, it's a lot of trauma and pain and nonsense back then. What we have. So, but I actually grew up in Wyoming, did my undergrad work here at the University of Wyoming. I worked in Narina's lab. I worked in Matt's lab. I sort of bounced around with that and then ended up doing my graduate work at SUNY Buffalo. So this was big for me. I'm going to New York. I mean, this is a big time New York. And then I got to New York and people were like, no, this is Buffalo. That's a different thing, right? So it's a very different sort of construal of the state as a whole. But program was great there. I had my advisor took a position when I was ABD, and so I ended up kind of following down her to University of Memphis and spent some time collecting my data, dissertation data down there. Still, I wasn't a Memphis University of Memphis student. I was still a Buffalo student, but they let me kind of crash on the couch and use their resources and teach some stat courses and stuff like that. So did that and then did my clinical internship at the Medical University of South Carolina. So like many of you, to a lesser degree, bounced around to a lot of different places. Thought I would never return to Wyoming, but then I was on the job market and Wyoming had an opening. And then they made offers to both me and my wife, Tara, who teaches the assessment portion and things like that. And so I was back in Wyoming thinking I would never be back here. And so have been back for 10 years. I used to be a new cool professor. I'm not now. I'm very sort of like kind of middle of the road professor. So like the worst professor. Like if you're not like senior old and you're not sort of new and cool, you're kind of stuck in the middle. But yeah, kind of me and sort of my trajectory with stuff like that. So very excited to work with you all. This is favorite day of the week to come in and talk with you all about stuff. So as we're working through material, if you have questions and you're trying to get sort of on track with stuff, please come through, talk with me. I enjoy, don't worry about asking me questions. Also, don't worry about what time you're sending me emails. I have weird hours. I sort of get started about 9 and sort of like sitting down and work. So if you're working on something and you need to have a question, don't worry about like, oh, Clap's gonna get mad if I send him an email and it's after hours. I don't like. Later on today, you'll go through talk with Carolyn and Ben and sort of do some orientation stuff, talk about expectations and sort of what things look like as a graduate student. I'm not saying that anybody has to be working until late in the evening, but this isn't certainly a 9 to 5 position. And so if you all are working together on stuff late, send me emails, swing by. I don't have office hours on the syllabus. It's just sort of whenever you want to swing by. If I'm in there, just knocking, if I can talk with you all, happy to sit down and get things worked together. Okay. So let's go through, if you've got your documents up there, let's talk through syllabus stuff real quick, just so we're all on the same page. Course description, sort of my information, sort of Matt's stuff is up there. Matt's fantastic, was in this sequence last year, did a really excellent job. And so Matt is going to be a fantastic resource. Utilize me, utilize Matt in order as we're working through the semester. Course description, thinking about this 50, 60, 5300 sequence as a sequence. It's kind of one class. We just kind of go from one thing to the next to the next. Fall semester, we're going to be working mostly on means-based stuff. This is our classical experimental approach, sort of ANOVAs, t-tests type of thing. That really builds that really forms the building block of a lot of our experimental research, and then kind of building up on that. In the spring, what we'll do is we'll transition to a lot of regression, repeated measures types of stuff, some more complicated analyses. But what we're going to try and do is build a foundation this semester so that you're comfortable as we start to layer on more advanced topics that people are kind of comfortable with where we're at with that stuff. Okay. Other thing too, thinking about even if, I don't know, one of the things that's nice with, I think, sort of a benefit of the stuff that we've got here, statistics is hard. It's intimidating for a lot of people, but it's a really, really useful tool. It's also an incredibly employable skill. You can make a fair amount of money doing this type of thing in terms of consultation. And so thinking about this not only as helping you sort of make your way, navigate your way through this program, potentially collaborations with other people as you're going through and working on projects and things like that, thinking about, and there is a world wherein we do have students come through the program who do end up being in analytic quant-like types of careers and industry and things along those lines. So I don't know that anything we learned specifically this semester, I don't know if t-tests are going to make you bank, but like if you continue on to go through, you think about this as some of the building blocks. So that consultation piece is also a big thing to keep in the back of your mind if it's, you know, halfway through the week and you're tired of staring at screening stuff. Like, hey, I'm sort of building employable skills. So, all right, prerequisites, we won't worry too much about that. Learning objectives, just basic stuff that we're going to make sure and go through. Competencies, hopefully we'll have you at by the end of the semester. The text. Who have people gotten the text for this class? Okay, show of hands if you got the text. Awesome. What's up? Yeah, the textbook. Yeah. Did people get I'm just curious, like what did people get? Is it like electronic copy, hard copies? Like, so what are people going through and doing with this? Hard copies. Okay. All right. Did people buy it at the bookstore? Awesome. Okay, good. The bookstore sucks. I'm not supposed to tell you that, but it does. A bunch of crooks. Yeah, they're always like, oh, give us your textbook. We got to know like 7 months in advance. And then start of the semester turns up, they're like, oh, we don't have anybody's textbook. So good. Glad you went through and got that. This is for those of you who have a plan to continue on to have but have research as part of your thing. So this is something that you are going to have as part of your career. This is going to be a really, really fantastic text for you to keep as a reference. This is probably one of the best stat texts that I've got. It sort of gets into depth and things along those lines, but does it in a relatively accessible way, at least from the perspective of stat textbooks. So as you'll see, as we look through the schedule, we've got a lot of readings and textbook chapters and things like that. If you're finding, if we're going through stuff and you're just crushing it, knocking it out of the park, and this is all kind of review to you, cool. But if you notice that you're starting to maybe struggle or not be 100% on some of the concepts, the text chapters that we've got assigned for before each lecture, if you go through and read those before you come in for lecture, it's going to just make you might not 100% get everything in the textbook, but it's going to start to sort of create a foundation to start hanging the stuff that we're talking about in class on stuff, start to scaffold things, and things will start to click. Okay. You are all very, very busy. And I know you have things, you're going to have things that are competing for your time outside of statistics. I don't feel like statistics should be anybody's top priority necessarily, unless you're in a bad spot where you're kind of on the border, then maybe statistics needs to be a higher on the priority. Big part of graduate school is trying to manage time, right? We've given you this much to do and this much time in the day to do it. So a lot of this is kind of going through and triaging and trying to figure out sort of what comes in and what goes where, right? But sometimes there's things that we can do on the front end that makes our life easier on the back end. I usually miss these things, but for this type of stuff, if you're able to go through, do those readings, the stuff that we do work through in class is going to make a lot more sense. It's going to click for you easier. And then it will, time that you spend reading ahead of time far and away makes up for the time that you'll spend on problem sets, struggling and trying to figure things out instead of connecting things. So I strongly encourage you to make use of that, of those textbooks. So I'm very, very glad people got it. Okay. Lectures are here. Important to note that we're going to go through, and I'm going to hit on sort of the big stuff, but we're not going to cover everything, right? As we're going through and looking at the schedule, you're going to have readings, you're going to have other stuff that we may not touch base on specifically in class, okay? Big part of graduate level work is being able to take materials, read, sort of derive information without someone explaining sort of step by step, because you know what, you're all brilliant people. You don't need me to read the article to you because you're capable of reading yourself. That said, you may run into things that are unfamiliar to you, or you're not really seeing the arguments that are being made in the paper, things along those lines. If that's the case, come talk to me, talk to Matt. Want to make sure that you're on top of those things, because some of those papers will come into evaluations and things like that. So even if we're not talking with them in lecture or they don't pop up on an assignment, still responsible for those. So make sure that you're doing your reading. And again, big part of this first year is transition into graduate school is time management, figuring like, how do I go through and do this? Now, if you're like me, what you'll do is wait to the end and then have a ridiculous cram and you're up until 3 a.m. and sort of trying to go through and do some stuff. That'll happen. Sometimes you learn from that, sometimes you don't. But if that's you, you just like, well, this is how I do things. And that's kind of if I'm up at 3 a.m, that's and I'm miserable, that's my own fault, because I sort of put this off to the last minute. But I would encourage you to be better than me and not do that. To the extent that you can keep up on these readings, it will help us when we get into evaluations and things along those lines. Okay. Software we'll be using is primarily going to be SPSS based. Who has experience with SPSS? Okay. Is that anybody other use other anybody else use other programs? Yeah, Johnny, you are right with some of your stuff, some R stuff. Okay. This is an ongoing discussion, sort of back and forth. I don't use R. I was trying to do something. I had have Johnny come in and help me figure out how to input things into R a couple weeks back. It may be something that we end up transitioning to because it's starting to become more and more common. It's also free, which is awesome. SPSS is user friendly, but those crooks make you go through and pay for it every year. So if people are stealing SPSS, sometimes that happens, right? I'm not mad about that. You've got access to the lab up here. That's fine. However you want to go through and use this. Now, the updated versions SPSS has, I've been talking trash on SPSS for the past 10 years. they went through and made some changes, so it'll do things like calculate effect sizes and things like that. It's simple math. I don't know why they weren't doing it before. Makes things easier for you, so that some of the things that previous cohorts had to do, you won't have to do, because SPSS already does it for you. So just for ease, and so we're not trying to teach you coding or programming language on top of statistical concepts, we'll go through and use SPSS. Now in your labs, they might use different programs, but really the program is the least of your worries, right? Particularly for the stuff that we're doing, haven't been like massive advancements in t-tests and ANOVAs in the past 10 years, right? The program that you're using to get the output doesn't matter, right? So long as you understand what it's doing, you're sort of getting the running the right procedures and things along those lines. I use Stata, which is a different program. So I'm going to go through and incorporate some of that stuff. If you're not using Stata, ignore it. Don't worry about it. I think Johnny is going to use Stata just in terms of sort of building sort of comfort with sort of different types of programs and things like that. I made the switch from SPSS to Stata and like it a whole lot. It's not perfect, but it's a program. If you're interested in sort of utilizing some of that, sort of come talk to me. It's a great program, but for the purposes of class, we'll just do most of our stuff in SPSS. Okay. Questions about any of that? Awesome. All right. Also in class, make sure to have a hand calculator, because sometimes we're going to go do it through and do stuff, and I'll ask you like, hey, what's this? And like, I'll get a bunch of blank stares, and I'm like, do math, calculate it, so let me know. So we're going through and sort of having that. So make sure, whether it's a phone, what have you, or a computer, laptop, whatever, just make sure that you got something out there. Okay. Other thing too, just in terms of thinking about efficiency and learning outcomes and being successful with the minimal amount of struggle. Okay. It's interesting, like learning is, so when you look at research on learning, confusion is an important experience as you're going through and learning things. Not having the answer directly in front of you sort of forces your brain to kind of work through and make connections, and that's a good thing for more in-depth learning. But I also don't want you to be sort of banging your head against a wall and sort of feeling lost for multiple days on trying to solve something, okay? One thing though that can help you doing that, we're going to go through and we're going to talk about a lot of information. A lot of this is going to seem pretty simple, but I would strongly encourage you to have some sort of note-taking approach, so that as we're going through, now what we've started to do with the advancement of technology, things along those lines, like you can go back through and find lectures from previous cohorts going back several years now. It's all on YouTube. Like I got them still posted up as a resource for, let's say you're 3 years down the road and Kate, you're trying to figure out back, oh boy, I'm trying to, like, you could literally go through and just pull up our class and go through and watch it for posterity's sake and things along those lines, right? But it's also nice if we're doing this, if you just got notes that you can go back through and take a look at and don't have to review the video. Having a strong approach to note taking. Now, different people take notes in different ways. Some people have gotten good and comfortable sort of taking notes on the computer. Some people have sort of like, there's, tablets and things, whatever your situation is, just please make sure that you're sort of going through taking notes, because otherwise I guarantee you'll be in the middle of trying to actually apply some of this stuff and you're going to be lost, right? So having those notes is good for the problem sets. And again, trust me, as you get into thesis, dissertation, other projects and stuff like that, it's nice to have those notes to go back on. So just have just make sure that you have a system for taking notes as we're walking through lecture and stuff. Okay. Questions about any of that? All right. Wild courses, it's pretty straightforward. Don't need to worry about that. You've all been able to pop up and get this. The problem sets for the class is going to be the bulk of your grade. These problem sets are all going to be applied, almost all going to be applied problem sets. Early on, they're going to be pretty straight. Well, they're tricky because statistics can be tricky. But it's going to be focused mostly on, do you understand concepts and sort of things along these lines. As we start to get into actual analyses, what I'm going to do is be giving you actual data for you to go through and work with. And this is real life data that we've collected. So it's messy, A lot of times it doesn't make sense. A lot of times it doesn't get exactly at the question that we want to go through and look at, but that's applied research, right? And so I think it's good to go through as opposed to having manufactured sets where everything comes out to whole numbers and all our data are normal. Actually looking through back out, okay, this is what I've got. What do I do with this, right? So as we start to go in, we're going to have these first couple of sets will be less time intensive than some of the stuff that we'll get into. So please, with these sets, make sure that you give yourself enough time to go through and do it. These aren't assignments, particularly as we get going, where you're going to be able to just like the day of or the night before, you're going to put yourself in a real bad situation. Okay. You may hear things from previous cohorts about sort of the time spent sort of doing this stuff. I mean, take that with a grain of salt. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be an anxiety generation type of thing, but do know that it will take you a while to go through and sort through this stuff because it's going to be new stuff for most of you. So give yourself enough time so that you're not pressured at the end, rushing and not sort of getting the most out of these. Okay. At least get it open, kind of look, sort of game plan. When am I going to go through and work through this stuff? Other thing that we're going to be doing this semester in terms of changing things around is I'm going to go through, and so there's 12 of you in the class. I'm going to be randomly assigning you into groups. We'll do groups of 3. Okay. And so this is going to do a couple of things for you all. You'll have 3 people working on a project or on an assignment where you're all turning in just one assignment. Okay. This should help diffuse things out and sort of be better for your own time in terms of going through and working through things, which is a good thing. It also is going to make it manageable for Matt and I to go through and grade these assignments and go through and provide feedback and things along those lines. Yeah. Problem sets. Yeah. And so we've done group work in the past. We've never done like where everything is going to be group assignments. So we're going to see how it goes. Okay. We're going to have to just think about, as the program continues to grow, like how do we go through and manage things? I think this is a good way to go through and do this because really these assignments is where all the learning happens. I can come up here and talk to you about stuff and you're like, okay, I kind of get it. But it's really when you sit down, when the rubber meets the road, trying to go through and actually work with the actual data, that's when things start to sink in. You will likely learn more from each other than you do from me as you're going through and working through this stuff. These group environments can be very, very helpful. And since I've been teaching this course, with rare exception, the one person who's out on their own, not working with anybody else, is rarely doing as well as the people who are coming through and sort of working. This is consistent with work in our field, right? We learn from colleagues, we learn from sort of working in a group. I think I've got a beat on this, but someone else says, hey, no, sort of really what we need to be doing is this, right? So it's a good environment to be working with. Okay. The one thing that you need to be thinking about though, is we're going through and doing this, not because people are necessarily not wanting to pull their weight or do things. What can happen in group dynamics is, particularly if you have a strong leader, if someone has established themselves as sort of an expert, or someone just really is, things are clicking for someone sort of better than other people, is to just kind of sit more passively within these groups. And then it's a group assignment. You get the assignment that the group gets. Things are fine. But for me as an instructor and for an evaluation standpoint, that's problematic because I need to know that you know sort of what's going on. Okay. So the assignments are going to be the main book of the grade, but what we're going to do is also we're going to have a midterm and a final for the class. Okay. Midterm and the final is your opportunity to demonstrate to me that you understand these concepts. Okay. This is stressful, and I know it's sort of people, it's a point of anxiety for people because it is stressful to come in and say, okay, we've got 3 hours to sit down and sort of do this thing, right? Without notes or things along those lines. But it is a really good way to make sure that people are prepared and ready for stuff. And so just know within your groups, right? Hopefully everybody's contributing. Hopefully everybody's pitching in. Hopefully no one's just taking the reins and doing things for other people, because what that's doing is not allowing other people to make sure that they've got a good handle on this material, because there will be 2 of these exams where you'll need to go through and sort of be able to demonstrate that you understand sort of the processes and procedures and things along these lines. Okay. Also going to go through and very literally use random.org to group people together for each one of these assignments. It's the best way I know how to sort of get people circulating around so that the same people aren't working with the same people. And sometimes strong people gravitate towards, or people who sort of maybe have had a stronger background in some of this stuff sort of coming together. I want you to work together. I want you to learn from one another as we work through these assignments. Okay. Any questions about how we're going to set up these problem sets? Yeah. No, different groups. So you'll go through and rotate through stuff. Yeah. Nope. And that's, so you just set me up to just crush home runs off of that. Yes. That is an excellent question. Hold on. I'll get to that real quick. Yeah. Okay. Nice. Slam dunk. Okay. Next thing here, homework collaboration. Now, so I want you to be working together. Okay. This is very, very, very valuable. But what we need to do is make sure that we don't drift into, I'm presenting work that's not my own. Okay. And this can be a tricky thing to ferret out. And sometimes sort of I need to have discussions with people about sort of independent work and things along those lines. Okay. So if you all are getting together and you're talking about a problem, you're like, boy, how do we approach this? What are the things that we need to think about? What are the things? What are your answers that you got? I don't care about that. Right. That's just utilizing resources available to you, go through and do stuff. But when we start going through, Haley, and Allison, Allison, if you say, oh, Haley, here is how I set up, here's my syntax for this analysis, and you give Haley your syntax, now all of a sudden both of you are in big trouble. Well, or skirting on sort of being, because what happens is you just trying to help someone out, and maybe you back, well, it's just easier, and if I go through and do it on my own, I'll go through and I'll just use this. But now all of a sudden, if you've made a very specific mistake that shows up on your stuff, and your stuff matches up, and there's really not a good explanation for why that would, now all of a sudden we've got a situation where some serious stuff is going to happen, right? So anytime you cut and paste or copy anything that you didn't write, I dig out the Control C or sort of Apple equivalent of that sort of right now. I mean, it's just a bad thing to start with, right? For these assignments, it needs to be the work of your group sort of put together. Now you can collaborate with other groups and be like, hey, what did you get with this? Or what are you thinking about that? Or like, I'm really struggling with this. That's 100% fine. Go through and look at output. And so like, how did you approach this? What did you do? What are your thoughts and considerations? All that's fine. Having discussions about like which approach is going to be most advantageous for this, that's all going to be fine. But if someone gives someone else something that they didn't write, and then someone tries to like sort of like, oh, I'm going to make it mine, except I'm going to switch around a couple words or something like that, it's just too easy to see, right? Don't do that, right? Sometimes if everybody's sitting down in a group and you know, someone might be saying like sort of talking out loud sort of their sort of interpretation, and everybody else is writing it down, and then I got 5 identical sort of things that may or may not be right, it starts to become problematic, right? So use your own words, sort of go through and sort of do that. Just make sure that the stuff that you're submitting for your group is your work, is your independent sort of way to thing. This really is the most important thing for me, because I don't care about the numbers really all that much, right? I can teach a pigeon to peck sort of menus and tabs and things along those lines. Where I see whether or not you really understand this stuff is as soon as you have to start talking about it and providing interpretations. If you don't understand the basic concepts, it starts to become very clear very quickly that sort of you're not understanding sort of what you're actually doing, right? And so then we've kind of missed our mark. So just make sure as we're working through these groups that it's the work of your group. Now, as a group, you're going to be turning in one assignment, so that's nice. But if you have sort of cross stuff around groups, what I don't want to see is kind of the same structure, word for word thing like that across groups. Where like, oh, well, this is a whole class assignment where we just took the answer and then distributed it to everybody, and then some people tried to, you know, switch around some words or things along those lines. Okay, so those are the types of things that can start to get people into trouble. Yes. Yes. Oh, you'll turn it, what I'll have you do is send me, typically what it'll be is an electronic copy of the stuff so that I have a record of that. And then just a hard copy so that the GA and myself can go down through. Yeah. No. Just go through and emails there. Yeah. This, what I would hope is that you all are going through talking about this. And this is the thing. A lot of times, people are like, oh, well, this is your reason for doing anything in this class or in your work with advisors. Josh said so is not no, that doesn't carry any water with anybody except maybe me. So what I want you to do is have reasons for sort of like, hey, I think this is the best approach because of X, Y, and Z, right? And if you've got that and another person in the group has that and you just kind of can't come talk to me, right? Come say, hey, boy, we were kind of struggling with this. We kind of got a couple options. This is maybe the thing, and this is kind of the rationale. This is the thing, this is kind of the rationale. And I'm happy to just go through and just kind of talk you through, like, well, so what do we think about this, or why, how might this affect it? I'll get you on the right way. Again, I don't care about sort of right or wrong answers. It's not this kind of class. I mean, you need to have the right answers, but what I'm more worried about is you understanding why the right answer is the right answer. Because if you just got numbers because then I would just, if that was the thing, I just have you give me SPSS printout and everybody would get 100 because that's just sort of going down through and doing stuff. What I need you to do is understand interpretations and reasoning and rationale and stuff like that. So again, I'll come through, sort of give you some hits, point you in the right way, tell you the answer. I don't care. What I start to see in terms of what I'm grading is sort of your rationale and sort of how you're talking about it. That lets me know whether or not you understand it or just took what I said and just gave me an answer, but really don't understand why that's the answer. Okay. Does that help? Okay, cool. And again, if you have questions, just come talk to me. All right, cool. So in terms of evaluating the problem sets, we don't need to worry about this right now because we're not quite there yet. But thinking about what I'm looking for in these problem sets, did you adequately justify the approach that you took? Right? Did you give me a reason? Because oftentimes there's going to be multiple reasons. There are probably pros of one or maybe stronger than another. Tell me why you did and sort of what your thought process was. Did you get the right numbers? Did you give a meaningful interpretation of what you found? And then are things reasonable? Again, thinking from like a collaborative, like consultation type of thing. Like sometimes you can be a statistical genius, but if no one can figure out what the hell you did or nothing that you do is properly communicated so that no one understands, it doesn't matter, right? And so making sure that things are organized for my sanity, for Matt's sanity, but just starting to get into this is a professional skill. If I submit a paper that's I have the right numbers in there, but it's all over the place, it's going to get bounced immediately if the reviewers don't understand what the hell's going on with stuff. So that communication thing starts to become important. Okay. This last piece here, thinking very carefully about as we're going through and approaching this. Again, we don't do statistics just to do it just because we like to do. Sometimes we do. Maybe we just love statistics and it's just fun to run numbers. I allow that happens in the universe. But for most of us, we're doing this as a way to infer something about human behavior, right? So if you just tell me that something is significant or that something is that, or that there's association, that's probably not going to be adequate, right? Because that doesn't tell me anything about anything, right? The focus that I want to have in these assignments is saying, okay, here was the research question. What can we say about that based on the data? The data are saying that, yes, we do have evidence for group differences on this versus this. Okay, so we have at least some evidence for a difference, which is kind of consistent with hypotheses, maybe backwards from hypotheses. But sort of here are maybe the limitations. These are the things maybe we don't know. Yeah, we found some stuff, but this is why we might want to be cautious in developing strong interpretations, sort of pulling that stuff together. Again, I think people get tied up a whole lot with sort of what's the right p-value and what's significant, not significant. We're going to try and push you off of significance talk over the course of the semester, which is fine. But what I really want to know is, like, what does this mean about, how does this help us understand behavior? That's really the crux of what we're looking at. So making sure that that's a focus of these assignments. Okay. Grading, A's, B's, and then below passing, because it's a graduate course. Stuff there. Attendance, make sure that you're showing up for stuff. Makes some sense. Student conduct, again, sort of outside of just don't come in and be disruptive, which is not something that I would think we would need to be worried about too much with graduate level classes, but also thinking about sort of your position in a sort of graduate cohort, a larger community, and things along those lines, right? Sort of being professional in sort of your conduct with supervisors, with instructors, and with one another, okay? Treating people with respect. Nothing says that you have to like everybody 100%, although some of your best friends that you'll ever make will happen here in this graduate course, right? It's kind of a doctoral programs are kind of a trial by fire situation, right? But wanting to make sure that everybody in class, outside of class, is working with one another in professional ways. Here, some things that for me are just kind of my own buttons that I want to make sure, and sort of for me, things that reflect professional behavior, being on time. Okay. Today was sort of our first class and things like, and I'm not sort of calling you out. No, but it is one of these things. I've only got you for 2 semesters, right? In our curriculum, we've only got 2 set quant classes that we've got, which in my mind is really too much material to fit into that amount of time. So we want to be here ready to go when things are going on. Sometimes you get towards the middle of the semester, things start to get loosey-goosey, you know, wandering in like sort of right when things are supposed to start, and then you got to get sort of yourself set up and things along those lines. Or if we take break, people coming in, sort of like kind of wandering in, please be respectful of other people's time, sort of my time, make sure that you're here locked in. Now, if you've got something before or some reason where you're going to be coming in late, just let me know so that I can be aware, and then we'll probably just get started and things along those lines, right? But for this class and any class, sort of punctuality, again, it's a small thing, but it really starts to develop professional impressions and things along those lines, and making sure that, you know, if everybody else got here on time, it's hard to see like if someone continues to come in sort of late, and like, so just thinking about timeliness and things like that. Cell phones and other electronic devices, have those turned off, okay? If you've got an emergency, something that's going on where you need to have your cell phone monitored, let me know. I'm 100% fine with that. But if you're on your cell phone while we're trying to discuss, talk in class and things like that, and it's very clear you're texting or doing something like that, one, you're not paying attention, which is problematic because then you're going to be lost, and then you're going to be in bad shape and not being able to contribute to your group. 2, again, I would make an argument that sort of falls outside the realm of professional behavior. It's a long class, but you're also graduate students. My expectations of graduate students are higher than they are for undergraduates. I expect people to be able to sort of concentrate and focus and sort of work on things, even if it's boring and you would rather not like to, but at least sort of being there and sort of with me as we're going. Same thing with sort of taking notes on your computer and things along those lines. If you've got those open, make sure it's sort of task relevant stuff. If it's not, I can often tell. And also everyone behind you can also tell it's distracting to them. So just please stay on task with stuff. As we're walking through and sort of working on material, sometimes, particularly with number of stuff that can be a little bit dry, you know, if I'm sort of trying to gauge, so it's not just me talking at you, trying to ask you questions to say, okay, so what, if this is the thing, then what would we think? What would the interpretation be? Things along those lines. And if I just ask, we're going to have a lot of dead space, and it's because rarely will people sort of voluntarily just jump out of their seat to ask stats questions. And so that's also kind of a waste of time. So my approach is, I'm just going to ask you, back sort of, what do you think? Sort of, what do you think here? So what would be this here? which does a couple of things. One, it kind of forces you to pay attention, and two, it saves us a lot of dead space where we could be sort of moving through. Now that's stressful, right? Because you might not know the answer. If you don't know the answer, that is 100% fine, because there's a bunch of other people who also don't know the answer. But give me, the only wrong answer you can give me is I don't know, okay? I don't know is not an answer. I don't want to hear I don't know. Give me what do you think? Like, give me your best guess, right? Because that thought process that led you to that wrong answer is helpful for everybody else, because other people were thinking the exact same thing. But it is stressful, because if I ask you, you're all high achieving folks. No one is comfortable not knowing things, right? But if I ask Danielle, if I'm asking you something and you're sort of trying to work through it, and then all of a sudden we got a couple other people who are talking about something, what's maybe the automatic thought or the automatic interpretation that you have as you're sort of trying to work through something? That your answer is wrong, that they know that they're talking about you, something like that. It makes for a bad dynamic across the, and you're probably not, right? I hope you're not, right? But it's just automatically the stuff that our brains go to automatically, right? And so again, sort of under the umbrella of just be respectful while people are going through and working through stuff. Now, if you know, you can go through and sort of and help somebody out, right? I'm not just gonna let you struggle there indefinitely and put you on the spot, but sort of go through, be okay with being wrong. Like, just throw something out, like whatever you think, and oftentimes it's going to be right, right? As we're going through, just remember that everybody's kind of going to be under the gun as we're going through and doing stuff. And so just be respectful and be mindful of how side conversations, things along those might be interpreted, even if that's not what you're doing. Okay. Treating other people with respect, sort of recognizing that, I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the diversity piece of things. It's a numbers class, right? And so you're like, oh, so I don't know that diversity is a sort of a big issue in terms of algebra or math or statistical theory or things along those lines. But the context that we're working in, data that we're working in, there's really interesting questions about generalizability. So like, what are the limits of this? Like, what can we glean from this, right? Different people having different perspectives and things along those lines. So making sure that people are letting people be heard, that we're respecting different backgrounds and viewpoints, different orientations and trainings, and making sure to be conducting ourselves in a way that would be similar to how we would want other people to treat us if we're maybe going out a limb, talking about something, sharing a viewpoint or opinion or interpretation or things along these lines. Okay. Last thing, I know what time it is. Don't start packing up. Like, I'm very, very aware of the limits of our time. So hang tight. I'll make sure to get you out of here by time if there's something where I might carry you over. Like, my time ends at 5 o'clock. There's no reason for you to sit here after 5 o'clock. But give me until that time, right? I'll make sure we get you out of here on time with things. Okay. Academic integrity, don't cheat, please. Diversity statement, again, so this is what we're talking about. A lot of this has to do with sort of respecting other people's opinions, background, perspective, things along these lines. Again, this is something that a lot of the sort of the analysis and sort of work that we're doing, sort of different people might have interpretations, and so sort of recognizing that sort of things can start to come into the discussion of approaches and analyses, and sort of, does this get at stuff? Does it not get at stuff? When we're going through and working through assignments, right? Making sure, again, it's not just like, oh, here are the answers and this is the end all be all study. Thinking about, like, who does this apply to? Like, where does this generalize? What are the limitations of this study? And like, I love seeing that stuff, right? Because it shows thinking about things beyond just numbers. Numbers are a tool, but they're not the end all be all. So this is all going hand in hand with methodology, right? And so if I've got a small sample of undergrads from a liberal arts college in Ohio, and we're talking about social relationships and viewpoints and things along those lines, that might not capture the broad range of things. So we might say, sure, there are differences based on these data within this population. It looks like maybe there's differences here, but what we would like to see if we want to know more about this would recommend that maybe looking at sort of this sort of other groups and things along these lines. Okay, all of that stuff is great things to start to work into this. It's a thing that we oftentimes, even though we shouldn't, there's no excuse for it, that we sort of are kind of sort of brush under the rug, be like, oh, well, I've got this study from a sample of undergraduates in Wyoming, right? Like, well, that may be good in some areas and sort of not so good in other areas. It doesn't mean that it's the research of the data isn't worthwhile, but it means like that maybe there's things that we're not getting here, and recognizing that as sort of limitations and things, and not just saying, this is the other thing that drives me nuts, is people like, oh, we need a more diverse sample. Like, okay, sure, but why, right? Saying that we just need a more diverse sample is kind of a half-assed way of just like sort of writing off a limitation. Tell me why. Like, so what are we missing? What are the limitations? What don't we know, and what can't we understand? And what would that more diverse sample tell us? That requires more thought, as opposed to just saying we could have more diverse samples. We could always have more diverse samples, right? But that scientific thinking about like why this might be important, that I feel like is the thing that sort of spurs additional questions and research and more thoughtful discussion about what we know and what we don't know. Okay, so diversity stuff, disabilities statement here. Again, I'm sure you've gotten this in your other classes, but again, if anybody has could use accommodations, has gotten accommodations in the past, there's a huge step up from undergraduate to graduate level work. A lot of times people may have, just on raw ability, should have been able to sort of make it through undergrad. Graduate school can be kind of a game changer in terms of managing time and pressures and sort of volume of stuff. If you have anything that you've received accommodations for in the past that have helped you be successful as everybody else, please let me know. Or you can go through and talk with DSS. What that will do is that will start to get you set up with accommodations that are documented, so that no one else could say, well, so-and-so gets special treatment because they get X, Y, and Z. Like, nope, that's not special treatment. That's an accommodation for something that's been sort of documented through the proper channels. Okay. Given our area, it would be a pretty bum deal if people started passing judgment on other people about sort of the types of accommodations that would be helpful for them. So please, if this is something that's relevant, let me know. Get in contact, or let your advisor know, get in contact with DSS, explore opportunities, because it's always a bad situation if we hit the end of the semester and then someone makes it known, and then I'm like, well, at this point we can't retroactively go back and change things. Okay, so keep that in mind. Professional communication is kind of just carry over, just sort of make sure that you're sort of being professional in your emails and communications. Other thing too, I mentioned this with a couple folks on my supervision team. Again, one of those small things sort of like that will really start to endear you to your supervisors, instructors, advisors, things along these lines, is just being responsive via email, right? If someone says, oh, I didn't see that, I don't believe that 100%, because everybody's on their phone all the time. It's constantly there, right? Now, I don't expect everybody to get back to me right away with everything, because shouldn't be the most important person in your life, right? But from a professional standpoint, sending out emails, just something that says, hey, thank you, or I got this, or sounds good, or saw this, am headed off to class, or have a meeting. Can I get this back to you sort of this evening, or things along those lines? Really small stuff, but means so much to us, because otherwise I'm just sending something out in the universe. Who knows whether or not you got it, you didn't, whether you paid attention to it, or things along these lines. So again, sort of things like being on time, just being responsive to emails, even if it's got it, thanks, sounds good, sort of that type of thing. Would be surprised how far that goes. So just keep that stuff in mind. FERPA, I'm going to talk with your parents. Title IX discrimination, stuff like that. Hopefully people are familiar with this, but for anybody experiencing harassment, sex gender-based harassment, assault, discrimination, things along these lines, sort of Title IX protections and things along those lines. These are things that if it's going on, you very much need to and should talk with your advisor about this, because this is serious stuff and we want to make sure that people are not feeling discriminated against, unsafe, God forbid, harassed or assaulted or things along those lines. Okay. So hopefully it's not an issue, or hopefully it's not something that comes up, but sort of doing this type of work, we know that it happens all the time. So do make sure that you're in communication with people if things are going wrong that way. Okay. All right. Resources on campus, green dot stuff, bystander intervention, things like that. Last thing we've got on here, COVID policies. All right. We're kind of in a weird spot. Like, COVID's not gone. We're kind of pretending it's gone. And different people, depending on sort of their circumstances, have different things and sort of considerations. Also, in addition to COVID, we've got sort of seasonal flu and sneezes and sort of other types of things going around, right? Let me know where you're at with stuff, right? If you've got a stuffy nose and you've tested sort of multiple times on rapid tests and those rapid tests are coming up negative, probably don't have COVID. But also, maybe not sniffles is the thing to pass around if everybody's on heightened alert from illnesses and things along those lines too. So if you've got a cough or something along those lines, if you test positive for COVID, like, stay home. Like, we'll get it figured out. Like, don't come in with COVID. If it's sort of more routine stuff, maybe you throw on a mask, right? Sort of Robert today, my graduate student, sort of learned that he had been sort of indirectly or sort of exposed, had an exposure sort of a couple days past, probably okay, but he just kind of masked up. We had Robert and team and it was fine, right? So thinking about that now, if you do happen to come down with COVID, which is more likely than not, probably, like, this stuff is nuts, right? I don't know, like, anybody have like a background in like bio stuff or anything along those lines? Like the transmissibility of this, like, so my brother is he's a biologist for the state and is back sort of working on his PhD, and so he's in an infectious disease class, and they're talking about like R naughts and stuff like that, and it sort of is like, for a long time measles was the most contagious. Like, if I looked at somebody and I had measles, I'd probably give them measles. We just kind of take this sort of variants of COVID and step it up. So at this point, so no one should be ashamed if you get COVID. Like, it's floating around all over the place, right? But if you do test positive, let me know. We've got recordings. We'll make sure things are set up so you don't fall behind. You've got people in your cohort who are taking good notes, who you can go through and rely on and things along those lines. But also, if you have something that you are pretty sure isn't COVID, and you're still sort of wanting to come in and sort of not fall behind and things like that, sort of masks are a nice way. We've got a friend who's international faculty from South Korea. She's like, I don't understand what the big, like, we've been doing this all the time, right? Like, if you got a cough or sniffles or something like that, you just throw on a mask because you're not trying to give it to everybody else sort of around you. And if you don't, then you're fine, right? I think that's a nice model for how to sort of go through and conduct ourselves over the course of the semester, but just sort of keep me in the loop with stuff. Okay. All right. How does this sound? Everybody sort of A-okay with all of this? Any questions? All right, cool. Well, let's jump in and start talking about basic what do you think it is? All right. What we're going to start with today again, just some foundational things. Talking about sort of purpose, sort of what we're trying to achieve with these different types of analyses, and so just review of basic concepts. These are all going to be things that you've had in other stat courses, but just want to do a quick brush up as we're working through things. Okay. So again, if we think about the purpose of statistics, or why we're going through and running these models, one of the things we're trying to do is organize and represent large quantities of information, right? So a lot of times we're collecting data and it's a bunch of numbers, right? So here, if we've got how many drinks, how much did this group of students drink? Okay. It's actually not a large data set, it's quite a small data set. But I don't know, no one, has anybody here done alcohol research? We don't have one of Allison's students in. Anybody drink alcohol? Okay. We'll go through and take a look at this. Like, question is, how much of this does this group of students drink? It's tough to process that. I'm seeing a lot of numbers. I'm seeing some big numbers. I'm seeing some small numbers. But to try and go through and organize this in an efficient way is probably not just sort of raw data stuff like that, right? And so if we're thinking about some basic descriptive statistics, what we could do is we could calculate means and standard deviations, right? Based on this. So we've got, looks like for this group of individuals, we've got 15 drinks a month. But is that where would you place, this is in your own personal estimation, where does that place average drinking for this group of students? Yeah, is that a lot or is that a little? What's that? You know, okay. Anybody have a thought on this? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like if you have, yeah, not too much. I think that's good. I think that's good, right? So if we've got maybe, so I have a glass of wine every other night or something like that, that would kind of get you sort of in this range, okay? But what else is going on in here as we're looking at this? What do you think, Johnny? You were a resident assistant sort of not that long ago. What else might be sort of thinking about in terms of looking at some of these statistics here? What about that standard deviation? What does that tell us? The variation around that mean, right? We can think about, when we're going to get in this, we can think about standard deviation as approximately, not mathematically exact, but approximately on average, so the random distance of any, the average distance of any randomly selected score from the mean. That's a 12 drink. If our mean is 15 and our standard deviation is 12, that means we've got quite a bit of variability in this, right? If we're looking at the range, we've got a range of 45, right? Saying that there's a difference in 45 drinks from the smallest to the largest, right? So we've got sort of a level of drinking here that is probably not too concerning. It's certainly not none, but a lot of variability in this set. So it starts to tell us something about, and if this sample is representative of the population that we're trying to study, tells us something about sort of drinking behaviors within this group, sort of a much more efficient way than just identifying and eyeballing stuff, right? We can also use graphical methods. You're going to be using a lot of graphs. We don't use graphs enough in our area, which is kind of crazy. But it's something that's starting to become, with supplemental online materials and things along those lines, to be able to just say, hey, this is what my data look like. It's Haley. What are you saying about that histogram? What would you maybe infer from that histogram there? A lot of variability. Yeah, maybe a little bit of positive skew there, right? But it looks to me like, sort of what's the modal number of drinks that people have per month? What's the most frequent category? Yeah, somewhere around 0 or 5, like somewhere down there, right? So most people are drinking very little, but we've got some people who are drinking quite a bit. So this graph is very simple, but all of a sudden starts to communicate more information about the characteristics of this sample than our descriptive statistics here. So it's adding value, right? So organize and representing data. We can also use statistics to go through and look at quantitative associations, representations between different variables, right? And this is a lot of what we end up doing. Let's say we've got 334 individuals exposed to traumatic injury, okay? And 248 of those individuals reporting chronic pain 12 months post-accident. And what we're interested in is the degree to which our pain status, if we're thinking about this as a yes/no variable, is related to trait level of anxiety. So we see different levels of trait anxiety in accident survivors who go on to develop chronic pain versus those who don't. Okay, how might we go through and answer that question? What might we do? We do an ANOVA. Yeah, we could do a one-way ANOVA, right? We could also do a t-test, right? That's kind of the sort of the breakdown if we only got two groups here. What we could go through is we can look at low pain or no pain, chronic pain, and kind of go through and do some stuff. We can run some statistics. We've got our mean difference. Say we're getting about a difference of about 5 points, close to 6 points in terms of difference in average pain score or anxiety score across these two groups. We can calculate a confidence interval. We're going to work a lot with confidence intervals. Confidence interval is saying, well, this is just one sample out of an unknown of number of possible samples that could be drawn. So my best guess based on the data is about 5.7 units on this scale, but my data would be consistent with anything from about 2.5 to 9, right? There's nothing that says that, yes, exactly within the population, the difference is 6 point or about 6 points. My data would say it's anywhere, these would be reasonable guesses for the population difference, right? So giving me a sense of precision. We can run a t-test. We can see a very small p-value there that tells us that we have evidence of a likely difference across these populations in terms of average pain scores. And then we can calculate an effect size. Effect size is telling us the magnitude of the difference, right? So just because I have a difference doesn't mean doesn't tell me anything really about the size of the difference. Here I could say, well, it looks like my chronic pain group is scoring close to a half a standard deviation above my no pains, above my no pain group. So again, all of these are thinking about statistics as convergent evidence. How many different ways can we go through and look to things to start to give us a picture about what's going on here? Okay, so this is our standard means-based test, right? How else might we go through and look at these data? What else could we do? Yeah, we could do a regression. Here, with just two variables, we could just run a simple correlation, right? We've got a dichotomous variable and a continuous variable. We can just run a Pearson correlation on that, right? And here we get a correlation of 0.4. We say, okay, that's a reasonable, that's a medium-sized effect for these data. Now, if I plot this out, that's not a nice scatter plot that tells me sort of like I can infer a whole lot from that. But what do is we could just, this tells us an association. This correlation and that t-test are mathematically equivalent. They're the exact same thing. The p-value is going to be identical for both of these, right? It's just a different way of representing this association. The only thing that determines which way is the better way is how you want to talk about it, right? So thinking about how do we use statistics flexibly to go through and quantify associations or estimate associations in a larger population, and thinking about of the ways that I have and I'm able to do this, what's the way that's going to communicate the most information to the next person, to my audience. All right. Other thing statistics does, gives us a standard language for professional communication. It's early, don't expect anybody has yet, but has anybody got on, read that Wilkinson paper? This is one of my favorite, like this is a phenomenal paper. Like it's like up at the top of my like favorite papers ever, which is weird because it's a statistics paper, but just so much really good information grounding to think about like how do we do things. A lot of times people get super tied up with fancy models. I love fancy models as much as an X person, but we don't always need fancy models. And it's not just about trying to have a chest beating contest on who can put together the most complex model when we don't need to, right? Some things I think pulling out of this, thinking about what statistical package you use is irrelevant. What's important is understanding what your results mean, how they were computed, sort of being able to go through and say, this is what this means. This is how this was derived. Just because a fancy computer spit out a result doesn't mean that it's the right result. It doesn't mean that it's interpretable. This all goes into methods and things along those lines where you, as the analyst, need to go back through and think about not just the numbers, but also the methods that produce those numbers. Okay. Again, recommendation from Wilkinson, taking efforts to assure that the underlying assumptions required for analysis are reasonable. We're going to spend a lot of time doing that, right? These analyses work really well if we're playing by a certain set of rules. If we don't play by the certain set of rules, all of a sudden our confidence in those interpretations start to get worse and worse to the point where maybe I can't interpret anything because I've violated all of my assumptions. Sometimes I can violate assumptions and it doesn't do too much, but sometimes if I start stacking violations on top of violations, things get out of control. So your responsibility is, as the researcher, to go through and think about, like, here's the analyses I want to do. Can I do that? I mean, there's no statistics police. They're not going to kick down your door and put you in zip ties because you ran the wrong analyses, right? But what could happen is you run an analysis that doesn't fit into the that doesn't fit the data, and so now all of a sudden I have interpretations, but they don't mean anything. Okay. Here, when you interpret effects, think about credibility, generalizability, and robustness. Again, anytime you get any type of results, first thing that you should think about, two questions. Like, this is, I've been doing this for a while now. Two questions that always come through my head anytime I'm doing things. Number one, what does this literally mean? Okay, so I've got a t-test, I've got a p-value, I've got an effect size. What does this literally mean, right? And if I don't know what that literally means, then I need to pump the brakes and figure out, what does this literally mean? And then two, if I'm right with that, does this make sense given what I know about this situation? Okay. If you're able to answer those two questions, you're light years ahead of most people in terms of sort of going through and conducting thoughtful analyses. Questions on any of this? Love this paper. Love this paper. All right. Some basic basic concepts. Okay. Talking about population versus samples. If I'm talking about a population of interest, or I'm talking about a population, population is a set of all individuals of interest. Okay. So, Abby, can you give me an example of a population? What's that? Nursing home residents. Cool. Where though? Laramie. Okay. Now all of a sudden we've got a very discrete population. Your interest is specifically nursing home residents within Laramie, Wyoming. Okay. So what we've done is we've taken something that could be a massive population and sort of narrowed it down to something that's quite small, right? And this starts to become important as we're going through and thinking about, who am I trying to generalize to? Now, thinking about a research question that only generalizes to sort of probably what you might be able to do then is explain the whole population, and then you got population-based stuff. If I've got population, I don't actually need to run statistics, because I just say, these are the groups that have this and these are the groups that have that. There's no need to, are the numbers the same? Nope, then they're different, right? If you're working with the population. Is this typical of the type of population that we're generally sort of, what are populations that people are interested in? Autistic individuals. Okay. Kate, where? In the United States. All right. Now all of a sudden we've got into a much larger population, right? And now all of a sudden, if I just get autistic individuals in Laramie, now I might start to worry about the extent to which my stuff starts to generalize, right? What else? Give me some other examples of populations. Okay. English language learners, right? Is that what you said? Okay. Yeah. And so now all of a sudden we've got something very different, right? Because there's lots of English language learners in different areas, right? And so thinking about sort of maybe from the standpoint of, like, within Sean's lab looking at sort of motivations and things like that. If I'm just sampling from the US, fine, and maybe that applies, but maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe English language learners elsewhere may we start to see different effects, right? So thinking carefully about this population starts to become very important. Who are we talking about? Who are we trying to generalize to? That's the question that will tell you kind of what your population is. A lot of times we're doing research and my hope is to generalize to all human beings, right? Now I need to start sort of pumping the brakes on the extent to which my data generalized to are representative of all people in need. Maybe so, right? There's some types of things that we go through and study is sort of like reaction time rates, sort of basic biological stuff that I don't know that sort of basic biology differs from sort of if we're looking at reaction times and sort of sensory processing in sort of here versus Europe versus sort of anywhere else, right? But that's a pretty thin set of things. A lot of the stuff that we're looking at in psychology, there's so much social and sort of cognitive and sort of background stuff that starts to go through and start to moderate some of this stuff. We need to be careful in terms of how we're thinking about things. Okay, APA task force study depends on characteristics of the population intended for analyses. Again, like a lot of people get defensive about this, don't want to think about it. I'm not saying your study isn't any good, but it starts to impact how I'm thinking about sort of the population. Now, if I am wanting to generalize this population and instead I sampled from this population, then you might have a problem, right? I'm not saying that all samples have to be perfectly representative because then it would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to conduct many types of research. But we need to sort of be smart and we need to be honest about sort of who we sampled from, what the population is I sampled from, and how that might impact my inferences and sort of generalizability and things. For a sample, this is our set of individuals or units selected to represent our population, right? Random sample is our gold standard. What's a random sample? What constitutes a random sample? And I'm sorry, like help. Olivia, okay, yeah. Okay. You tried to trick me. Use the word random to define a random sample, right? What constitutes someone helps out. What constitutes a random sample technically? Yeah.
Like
Yes. Right. So if everybody in the population has an equal likelihood of selection, then we've got a random sample. Olivia, do we ever get truly random samples? No. I mean, unless your population is really small, right? Right. I think you are all very, very special people. I don't know that anybody cares about sort of in terms of the larger literature, the specific dynamics of this group of people. But you're right. If you've got a very restricted sample, then maybe you couldn't start to go through and randomly select. But when we get into methodologies, it's very, very, even our best, what we would talk about in terms of a random sampling of adults in the US is not really a random. It's close. And sort of for our purposes, it's about probably as good as we can get, but it's not a random sampling of everybody, right? And so sometimes this is an issue. Sometimes it's always an issue. Sometimes it's going to be more of an issue than others, right? But one of those things is better, right? Why are bigger samples better than smaller samples? Power, okay, from a statistical standpoint. What about from just a more basic on a simple, what happens as my sample size starts to get bigger and bigger? It's more likely to get representative. If I hijack 10 people out of Praxis, right? Is that group going to be representative of the entire student body on campus? Maybe it might, right? I could get lucky and get something that starts to look like it, but there's also a good chance that I might start to get way off base with stuff, right? Maybe I'm interested, and we'll use this later, maybe like I'm interested in measuring the height of everybody on campus, right? And I just happen to go out there while the basketball team or the football team are walking through, and I just grab a bunch of those folks, right? Now all of a sudden I've got the 10 people I've collected, I say the average height of students at the University of Wyoming is 6'3", right? That's probably not going to be, but am I going to get the same? Is it easy for me to get that same mean if I go through and I get 100 people walking through Prexis? It's going to be hard, right? I'm not going to say it's impossible, but that's going to happen way out on a tail. That would be an extraordinary sample to get if we have normally heighted individuals sort of attending the university, which to my knowledge we do, right? So as that sample gets bigger, it starts to get more representative, and some of those outliers, some of those extreme values, if I grab somebody who's 7 foot tall, who's coming across, if that 7 foot tall person is being averaged across 100 people, it has much less of an impact than if I've got a sample of 10, right? So thinking about bigger as being better with this in terms of samples, okay? Variables and data, okay? Variable is just a characteristic or condition, changes, has different values. Who have I not? Jalen, can you give me, Jalen, right? Okay, Jalen, give me an example of a variable. Time is a variable. Sure, what else? Age, yeah, right. But basically, I was like, Jalen, shout words at me, and almost all of them will be variables. Anything that can differ across people is going to be a variable. I've got something that doesn't vary. If it's everybody has the same number, then I've got a constant. Constants screw up our analyses, right? We don't want constants. If we have constants, if I'm running like sort of looking at a difference across these two groups on something that doesn't change, there's no reason to go through and do it running analyses because I'm not working with variables, I'm working with constants, okay? Parameter, this is a characteristic that describes a population, okay? We usually in statistics identify these with Greek symbols. Statistics are a characteristic of a sample, okay? These are sort of our Arabic letters. We're working with statistics because we don't know the population parameters. The whole goal, the whole reason we're jumping into this endeavor is try and glean some information about characteristics of a population, but we can't access the population. So what we can work with is samples. Now, if we've got a sample that's representative and sufficiently large, then we can start to mathematically get really good at identifying reasonable parameters of a population. But as our samples get smaller, as they start to get less representative, we're going to get numbers, right? We just have much less confidence that those numbers are representative of the population that we're interested in getting, okay? Our descriptive statistics, these are procedures that just summarize, organize, simplify data. These are graphs, descriptive statistics, means, standard deviations, things along those lines. Our inferential statistics, this is our approach to trying to quantify associations, right? Differences and things along these lines, okay? These are our correlations, our t-tests, our models and things. What we're going to do, these are important. This is what this entire class is about. But these inferential statistics are not perfect. There are a lot of pretty significant problems that with these analyses in terms of what they say and what they don't say that we've known since the turn of the 20th century or before, right? People developing sort of the analyses that are the building blocks of behavioral science have way back into Fisher and like some of those old school statisticians like, hey, don't do that with these tools. These are tools that can do this thing. For sure, don't do this other thing. And what we've done is done that other thing, right? Now, in terms of what we have as terms of better alternatives, not a lot, right? And so it's not necessarily, I think, the tool that's the problematic, it's how we use the tool. So as long as we know so the strengths and limitations, what these analyses are really telling us and discriminate that from what we want them to tell us and are clear-eyed about that, then we can go through and do some good stuff with them. But it's not something that we talk about a whole lot because I'm saying like, hey, here I'm going to teach some stuff. The foundation of it is all terrible. But I think it's good to know that stuff as we go through so that we can use these skillfully. Okay. Questions up to this point? Yeah. Yeah, that's mu and sigma right there. Yeah, and so this is where we get into a different statistical notation, which I'm not like a huge stickler on this, right? But if I see, we'll get into our hypothesis testing, right? So I say mean is sort of mean 1 minus mean 2 is equal to 0. That's a hypothesis for our t-test, right? The population mean of 1 minus the mean of population 1 minus the mean of population 2 is equal to 0, which says functionally that they're equivalent, right? Now I go through and I get right, and then I go through and I say, oh, mean 1 and mean 2 are not equal to 0, right? Um, but this is my sample, right? And this is what people often will get sort of turned around on with our hypothesis test pick. Well, sort of my data say that there's no difference in these two samples. Is there a difference in those two samples? They're not the same number, right? Like they're for sure not the same. So there is a difference, right? But these are just representative of our populations. Now, what our statistical test is telling us is based on the data that we've collected, we don't have sufficient evidence based on the rules that we've set up to claim or conclude that there are differences across these two populations, right? But our hypotheses tests are always about our populations, they're never about our sample. Sample's a means to an end. We don't care about that, right? But what happens is people will start to say things that are nonsensical if you say there's no difference in these two means. Well, there for sure is a difference in those two means. It's just the difference that we've observed doesn't exceed what we would expect if we were to randomly draw samples of this size from two different populations. And so if those two different populations do actually have the same mean, it's not unreasonable to get sort of samples of this size that would represent that, right? So, and again, this is something that we'll talk about all semester and next semester, and we'll struggle with this a little bit, but sort of really sort of drive home our hypotheses tests are never about the samples. The samples are just trying to give us a signal so that we can infer something about a population, which starts to make it really, really important that we're very clear on what population we're trying to generalize our stuff to. All right. Statistical inference. Okay. So again, we've kind of talked about this, but again, I really want to get a visualization. Like this is one of these fundamental concepts that I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really have this down. Okay. Here's our population. This is who we're interested in, right? This is who we would like to, I would like to know something about autistic people in the US, some characteristic of autistic people. That's who I'm interested in because what I want to do is I want to sort of understand sort of some of their experiences, sort of thinking about interventions, sort of programming things along those lines. But I can't get all autistic people. There's no way for me to identify all autistic people in the US. But what I can do is I can sample autistic people in the US, right? And hopefully I've got methodology that gets a good representative sample of these individuals. And hopefully what I can do is study the characteristics of this sample, right, through some statistics and things along those lines to then draw inferences back to that population, okay? So again, as we're doing this stuff, the population is always sort of what we're trying to get at. Now, when we talk about it, when we write about it, we talk a lot about samples and this sort of sample this, sample that, which is fine. It's kind of how but we need to sort of pump the brakes and remember that we're not talking about the sample. The sample is just sort of one of an infinite number of samples that could be drawn. And I can get a weird ass sample that ends up way out in left field, right? That doesn't represent things. If I were to rerun this analysis again, there's nothing to say that I would see the same effect. Now we can start to think about size, power, things along those lines that start to make us maybe more confident that this is a replicable effect. But always remember that sort of our hypotheses and our inference is always about the population, okay? So again, our statistical procedures, you made inferences about a population based on the sample that we've collected, okay? And if we start to think about this, it starts to make it very apparent like why we need to be thinking about how we've selected our sample, the generalizability of our sample, the representativeness of our sample, right? This is pretty easy to sweep under the rug and you can do it and no one will probably call you out for it, right? But if we're trying to be clear-eyed about our own research and what we think we know about things, this is a very, very important thing to start to keep in mind. People comfortable with this? Again, it's probably not new news, but I think it's something as we start to sort of develop into professional researchers, something that we always need to have in mind when we're evaluating our research and others. All right. Yeah. Our hypothesis is never about to sample. Never about to sample. This is where I will ding you for sort of this spec. Sort of my null hypothesis is sample A is no different than sample B. Like, nope, it's not. It's about the population, right? But what that's going to do is it's going to force you to identify the population of interest, right? Which is going to get your gears going at a little deeper level. Okay, we'll finish up with sampling error. I want to give you guys, you all a minute to sort of go before Carolyn comes and collects you to go to the next thing. Sampling error is a good thing to finish up with. Sampling error. All right, everybody look at me. All right. Sampling error is all sampling error is just the discrepancy between a sample statistic and a population parameter. I have a hypothetical population parameter. There is some unknowable number that represents the average height of women in the US. Okay. We will never know what that exact number is by observing it directly. Okay. But what we can do is we can start to sample. And if we get very large samples, we can probably get pretty functionally sort of we can know what it is if we get a large enough and a representative enough sample. But for the samples that we go through and get, what we're going to get always, even if our sample is representative, we're always, if we carry this out to a far enough decimal, we're always going to get some difference between the population parameter and the sample. Okay. It's impossible for our sample to exactly match the population of interest if we've got sufficient precision and things along these lines. Okay. So we say, let's say we've got our population. So we've worked things down. So this is our version of all of the folks in resident living assisted programs in Laramie, right? So we say here in this 1,000 college students, this is our population. For whatever reason, these are the only people we care about, is just these 1,000 people. This is our population. These are very special students. These are the only students of their type, just these 1,000, right? And we go through, we know that for this group of 1,000 students, average age 21.3 years, average IQ, getting close to a standard deviation above 5, 35% men in this, okay? And what we do is we go through and we, from this population, we draw 2 samples. Sample 1, we got Eric, Jessica, Laura, Karen, and Brian. Sample 2, Tom, Kristen, Sarah, Andrew, and John, okay? And we go through, we've got these sample 5 people, go through and we calculate the statistics from those samples, okay? This is our sampling error, okay? The extent to which these sample statistics differ from the population parameters is sampling error, okay? We're always going to have sampling error, right? What determines the level of degree to which we have sampling error are going to be things like sample size, right? Is this, if our population is 1,000 people, is this a sufficient sample size to be drawing from this to make strong interpretations about the characteristics of the population? Probably not, right? What's going to happen is we're going to start to see if we were to repeatedly draw samples of 5 from this population of 1,000, what's going to happen in terms of the consistency of, say, my average age? What's going to happen across repeated samples? It's going to start to jump around a lot, right? From sample 5 to sample 5 to sample 5 to sample 5. My estimates, they're probably not going to be way off, right? But they're going to jump around quite a bit. What happens is I start to get, let's say, samples of 100, 200, 500. What's going to happen to the stability of that estimate? Going to be locked in, right? This gets us our standard error. To what extent do we expect this sample to jump around across repeated sampling of the thing, right? So our standard error is going to be much higher with this small sample than the large sample, right? So 1 sample size and then 2 sample selection, okay? If I'm trying to look at grades, GPA for this group, and I only sort of sample the people who show up to the 8 in the morning math class, and I use that as my sort of estimate for GPA for this for the population as a whole. Why might that be problematic? that a random sample? Right? What might we suspect about people who show up consistently for 8 a.m. math classes if they're a college student? Yeah, these may be people who are like, "Oh, I'm not excited about rolling out of bed at 8 in the morning for a math class, particularly if I'm out sort of engaged in other activities that students are engaged in, right, that are normative and things along those lines." What I've done is I'm started to select my sampling procedure is bias, and sort of what I might be picking up is systematic differences. And I'm not necessarily talking about like smart people show up and not, because that's certainly not true, but it's people who might be more dedicated, sort of more sort of focused, sort of more have put a higher priority on doing well in class. You're maybe not getting the C's that get degrees folks, irrespective of sort of overall ability, right? And so what happens is we start to have more sampling error because we've selected a sampling strategy that doesn't sort of that catches systematic bias, right? Also our measurement tool, okay? If I go through, and this is a fun example. Let's say I want to sort of, I'm a health researcher, right? And what I want to do is look at the average body mass, sort of something like that for sort of undergraduates, right? And so in study one, I've got a digital scale where I'm having people come through and sort of step on the scale, recording their stuff, right? You've got a very precise instrument. And the second study, I just kind of come up and I kind of just like pick people up and they, all right, you go, call it $1.20, right? So to go through and right there, is my measurement invalid? Probably not invalid, probably not ethical, certainly strange, but it's not reliable, right? And so what I'm going to be is I'm going to be all over the place. And it's funny, but essentially this is what we're doing. If I just make up an instrument back, oh, these questions should probably get at this construct of that I'm wanting to get at, and I just hand that out without looking at the psychometrics, the measurement properties and things along those lines. Building your own instrument is essentially the same as sort of just picking people up and sort of guessing their weight, right? It's functionally the same thing. Now, maybe I'm really good at just sort of guessing people's weight. That's a possibility, but absent other information, I shouldn't be super confident that that's getting at what I'm getting at in a reliable fashion, okay? So if we're thinking about things that impact the difference between our sample statistics and our population parameters, we're always going to have sampling error. Doesn't matter if I have a perfectly representative sample, a very large sample. Doesn't mean that my sample is biased in any way. It just means it's different. The discrepancy that I get between that population parameter and the sampling statistic and the sample statistic is my sampling error. But the things that impact that are size of my sample, how I go through and collect that sample, and the tools that I'm using for this. All right. And this is huge. This is where this methodology starts to come through. We'd be like, oh, hey, I got some garbage methodology. How do I fix this from a statistics standpoint? You can't. There's not like, whoa, isn't there a correction or something? Nope. I can't unfix a terrible with statistics. I can't unfix bad methodology. Best thing we can do is we can say, well, this is what we can say, but here are all the limitations, right? So thinking carefully about methodology stuff as we move forward. All right, cool. We'll call that. I didn't give you a ton of time to go through and break, and I'm sure they won't force you into the second floor conference room sort of right away. Can give you all a break so you can go take a breather. But any questions before we shut down for today? Oh yeah. Go through, sign those real fast. That just says one that you're not going to try and publish the data that I give you because it's sample data and I've messed with it. So don't try anything that we've used and publish a paper with it, because that would be bad. The other thing too is saying that, so do you recognize that I'm going to give you a bunch of materials and feedback on assignments and things along those lines? This is like sort of your honor pledge saying that sort of down the road, if you were to have new students in your lab, that you're sort of recognize that the materials that you get are for you and for you alone, not to disseminate to other people, not to sort of pass along to junior students down the road. If you do that, that's a big problem, and we'll probably have to have a discussion about that, right? So just go through, sign those, and just sort of you can go through and toss them up there on the thing. I'm also asking you, so if you have, that was a very brief explanation of what those things are about. But if you have questions, you can come talk to me afterwards. If you understand, so you can go through and sign those and just put those up and I'll collect them. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll pick back up with the rest of this descriptive stuff next week and probably start rolling into the next thing. I'll make sure we get that posted. And then what we'll have is an assignment that's due after our next class. So just in thinking about sort of your schedules, not Friday of next week, the Friday the following week is when that'll be due. First assignment, pretty basic. Make sure that you go through and read those initial Howl chapters, though. That's going to give you a really, really nice background. We're moving through this pretty quick. The Howl stuff will sort of make sure that you're in the right space for tackling this first assignment. So awesome. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, that works.